Good evening. I'm Beth Finnerty, President and CEO of Skyland Trail. I want to welcome all of you to the 10th anniversary of the Dorothy C. Fuqua Lecture Series. This annual event was established in 2011 to honor our longtime board member and great friend and benefactor of Skyland Trail, the late Dorothy C. Fuqua. Dottie was a champion of eliminating the stigma of mental illness. As such, one of the goals of this lecture series is to amplify the voices of mental health experts and individuals with lived experiences to elevate mental health as an issue of importance here in Atlanta and across the country. This decade-long series has been made possible by generous support from Duval and Rex Fuqua and Edwina and Tom Johnson. Thank you, Duval, Rex, Edwina, and Tom, for honoring Dottie in such a meaningful way and for your leadership, your vision, and your steadfast advocacy for mental health. As the COVID-19 pandemic eases across the country, Skyland Trail is seeing an incredible demand for our treatment services for both adults and adolescents, as well as an increased need for financial aid to help individuals and families access these programs. It's going to take all of us to help address the tidal wave of mental health needs that is upon us. I hope the program this evening will inspire you to help someone access what can be life-saving mental health treatment through a gift to support the financial aid program at Skyland Trail, by contributing to a mental health organization in your own community, or by supporting someone you know who may be struggling. Tonight, the focus of our lecture is on the intersection of mental health and competitive athletics, specifically the Olympics. We are fortunate to be joined by an Olympic silver medalist, as well as the director and producer of the film documentary, The Weight of Gold. As the world prepares for the Summer Olympics in Tokyo, thousands of athletes will soon face a few moments of competition that could define a lifetime of training. Our panelists will discuss the mental health toll of high-performance sports and what we can do to better protect the mental health of athletes, from Olympic medalists to Little League players. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists and moderator for our conversation this evening. Our panelists are psychiatrist and Skyland Trail's Charles B. West Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Ray Kotwiki, sports psychologist, Dr. Kenza Gunter, the Weight of Gold director and producer, Brett Rapkin, and the 2006 Olympic silver medalist and world champion figure skater, Sasha Cohen. Our moderator for this evening is WXIA TV 11 Alive news anchor and reporter, and a 2021 Rosalind Carter Fellow for Mental Health Journalism, Christy Diaz. Welcome to all of you. Now, before we jump into our panel tonight, I'd like to share a brief trailer for the documentary that Brett wrote, produced, and directed, and the film in which Sasha so courageously lent her voice and her story. The film is inspiring and heartbreaking, and I hope each of you get the chance to see it in its entirety before too long. The Weight of Gold brings together a range of Olympic athletes sharing their stories of struggle, proving that mental illness can affect any of us, even those we think may have it all.
Michael Phelps is one of the fastest swimmers in the world.
None of us had normal childhoods.
I want to win.
I knew it was the biggest stage that I would perform for in my life.
For Olympians, that's what defines you.
Athletes have worked their entire lives for this moment.
I wanted to do everything I could to be the best skater I could.
Everything revolves around this sole focus, and that sole focus is the Olympics. And now the next 40 seconds will dictate our human lives.
But after the Olympics, the village doors close, and that's kind of it.
Win or lose, I felt a dramatic emptiness.
We're just so lost. A good 80%, maybe more, go through some kind of post-Olympic depression.
It's gold, and then what?
I didn't develop outside interests.
I thought of myself as just a swimmer and not a human being. That's where I was just like, why don't I just end it all?
From the outside, it's like you got everything.
Athletes just don't talk about our weaknesses.
That just cracks the facade.
Mainstream media love building somebody up and then come crashing down.
Depression puts you into a spiral. You start getting deeper and deeper into it.
He was my best friend.
We have to do something. And this is important.
Youth around the world watch and look up to these people.
I've given my blood, sweat, and tears. And all I'm asking is that someone can help me get through this.
We're human. I don't think I have to say anything else.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Christy Diaz, and I'm so glad to be with all of you tonight. Thanks so much to Sasha, Dr. Kotwiki, Dr. Gunter, and Brett Rapkin for being here for this conversation, especially in May, Mental Health Awareness Month. I think we're going to have a really great conversation tonight. So, Brett, especially after just watching that trailer, I'd like the first question to go to you. That documentary, that film, it was so illuminating and it was viscerally honest. Why was it important to you to make this film and focus on this specific topic? You're on mute.
There we go. Hi, it's nice to be here. Thank you for having us. Yeah, the film started out as something very different. It started out as it was just going to be a short film about Stephen Holcomb, the captain of the Olympic bobsled team. We shared a mutual doctor here in Los Angeles who introduced us. And, it was supposed to be a short film about Stephen having overcome a suicide attempt. And, sadly, 12 days after our interview with him, which was here in LA as he prepared for the 2018 Winter Olympics, he passed away at the Olympic Training Center in Lake Placid, New York. And then the story really revealed itself. I first kind of just started to realize that it was a really tough roller coaster of emotions that the athletes went on. And I started sitting down with Sasha and Bodie Miller and Jeremy Bloom, or I think the next three. And what started to reveal itself was really not just the challenge that they go through, but also some of the resources that were lacking.
Sasha, they couldn't have made this film without you and other athletes like you who were so willing to tell your story, your willingness to be raw, your courage to talk about the gritty parts, the difficult parts, and be really vulnerable in this documentary. What inspired you and finally convinced you to be part of this film?
Jeremy had reached out to me, Jeremy Bloom, who was my Olympic teammate in 2002 and 2006. At the Winter Games, and introduced me to Brett. And it seemed like a no-brainer. At that time, a few years ago, when we were working on the documentary, I was, very much in the midst of redefining my identity and far enough away from my Olympic experiences that I'd had a chance to process and had been through those kind of lows and those valleys of emptiness, and was really looking for something in my life to find meaning and realized that I had done it largely alone, and that people, Olympians, athletes really needed to lend their voice to bring some prominence to the subject, because all the focus, all the media is really on that Olympic cycle building up to a games of the next star and their hopes for gold. And then the coverage just really diminishes right after the Olympics. And I think the story continues. We're humans, we're more than just athletes. And I think the biggest thing we can do to help other athletes down the line and others with mental health issues is just to put a voice to it and to name it.
Dr. Kotwiki, well, I'd like to come to you next because I think if anyone who has seen this film, you know, they'll look at it and they'll be amazed by the amount of athletes who are there, the number, the level and star power of the athletes in this documentary. But in no way am I an Olympic athlete, but I was still able to certainly relate to some of the struggles that they talked about in this film. And I think other people who watch it will too. So I'd like to broaden this out to people who may be watching tonight, who may see themselves in one of these athletes' journeys and some of the struggles that they discussed. If we're not an Olympic athlete, how might the perfectionism and the fear of failure show up in our lives?
Good evening, everybody. And it's a great question because perfectionism and the desire to be ultimately successful does not focus only on athletes, although certainly Olympians are a class that is very different from most people in the world. What we talk about in psychiatry is the difference between an internal locus of control and external loci of control. And what we mean by that is that when people do things and invest their time and talents and energy in something that they feel passionate about, that's an internal reason to do something. When people become obsessed really with what they receive, the accolades and the awards, the gold medals, the press, the fame, the fortune, we call those things external loci of control. And the difference between the two is really stark because external loci of doing things can be taken away very easily. And so if somebody practices for 10 years to perform for 40 seconds, what's after the 40 seconds? I think it puts somebody in a vulnerable position. And that is a fundamental human characteristic. We don't want to be in a vulnerable position. We want to make efforts to control our destiny and to do things that are important to us internally. So in that way, I think this is a great example of the human condition.
In the film, Michael Phelps says he thought of himself as just a swimmer, not even a human being. And that seems to be a theme that resonates throughout. So Dr. Gunter, as a sports psychologist, do you see this with athletes in other sports? And how do you help someone who comes to you for help and how do you help them look beyond the competition?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And thank you all for being here and for this conversation. What you're referring to is what we describe as athletic identity, right? And it's the way in which a person views themselves in relation to their sport or the performance domain in which they compete, right? The thing about athletic identity that's really important to know is that one, it usually starts early, right? If we're talking about Olympic athletes, they usually have begun participating in their sport at a very young age. And so who they are, how others perceive them, how others treat them is usually very closely tied to their involvement in their sport, right? And not only their involvement, but their performance. So their self-worth, a sense of worth, a sense of value can become very connected to the performance outcome. If I perform well, I feel like I'm a good person. If I perform poorly, I feel like I'm not. And there's a dedication and a commitment that goes along with pursuing an Olympic dream that sometimes might result in a person feeling that they have to let everything else go in that pursuit, right? So passion can sometimes take away the opportunity to develop other interests because of the singular focus on chasing that dream. So the fact that that athletic identity starts early, it's public. So again, not only is this how a person sees themselves, it's how everybody else starts to define them, but also there's a level of commitment and dedication that is required that sometimes results in not having room to explore other sides. And once a person is shifting away from sport for whatever reason, there's a recognition that they have not given themselves the opportunity or even had the chance maybe to develop some other aspects of who they are. And yes, definitely see that across sports at many different levels, including Olympic, professional, collegiate. That athletic identity and the lack of developing other interests is really something that we try to work on earlier so that when the transition happens, it may not be as much of a challenge because there are other things that they've explored. But it's a tough balance to strike when you are in the throes of pursuing a dream.
Sasha, I saw you nodding your head as Dr. Gunter was speaking. I know this is something you have spoken about personally. I mean, you poured everything you had into skating. You almost have to, especially if you're going to if you're going to be an Olympian, if you're going to go to the Olympics, that dedication is necessary. But you talked about having no identity outside of skating. And so it begs the question, whether you're an athlete or you're achieving for something else, do you think you can still achieve to a high level? Because we heard you as a little girl in the film talk about your dreams of being an Olympian, of getting to the highest level, which you did. Can you achieve the way you want to like that and have those big dreams while still being mentally healthy?
It's so hard to tease apart all the factors, I think, that go in, even from a young age, to what is natural drive in a child's personality that could be obsessive and they could find incredible meaning. I think when I found skating, that was the first home that I found. I didn't fit in school. I had ADHD. I couldn't really pay attention. And so when I found skating, I found something to direct my focus, something to work towards. And I watched the Olympics on TV as a 6-year-old, and dreams were born. And so there was this self-driven quality. And then I think as you are older and you start to understand what's possible, you realize it takes everything. And so for me, I didn't fit in school. And so deciding to be homeschooled didn't feel like a sacrifice. But it's very tough to say, because when, 10, 15 years later, when you're competing at the Olympics at the highest level, and this is the moment you've been training for your whole life, there's an incredible amount of stress, anxiety, and expectation, and the realization there are no redos. It's not like, if you fail a class, you can retake it. And I think dealing with all that, I would say it's normal, and when you go to the Olympics, to feel that way, because how fleeting this opportunity is, this once in a lifetime moment. So I would say the best way to, strike a balance would be to vocalize and have other prominent athletes vocalize what they're going through. And I think in my era of sports and competing, it was very much about suppressing any fear, suppressing any weakness, because if you admit that to the world, to yourself, you feel like it can undermine you, that your competitors have a mental edge, you feel less confident. And so I think 9 days out of 10, when your body's sore and you're having tough time training, you tell yourself, I'm fine, I'm the best, I'm going to win, I'm going to do it. And so you're really trying to suppress the negative kind of realities of what it takes to train and deal with injuries and the pressure. So I don't know, I'm sure there are other people on this panel that are much more qualified to answer and have the education to back it up. But it's a question I've been asked before, and I don't know quite what the struggle is, except the first thing you have to do is name it, get it out in the open, and to know that it's normal, but I don't know how that makes it go away.
We'll definitely get some of the doctors' perspectives on that. I'm going to come to you in a moment to answer that same question. But Sasha, what you said was so important about getting it out in the open. And I think that's what this film did. Brett, you interviewed a range of athletes across several different sports. And I think some people will be surprised at these people who, from the outside, from our society, who look at them as having it all, were so honest about their struggles, and how many people and athletes specifically talked about suicide. A big part of this film, I believe, for you was to break the stigma. What do you hope has made a difference, and what impact do you hope this film made? Was it about breaking stigma of mental health?
Yeah, I think that, any athlete, we put athletes on such a pedestal in our society. And none more so than Olympians, right? They're the Greek gods that come down every 4 years from Mount Olympus and wow us with their talents. Michael Phelps has been talking about his mental health struggles for the last several years, and seemingly every time he does, it makes national news. It's front page on CNN.com, et cetera. And I think it is because it's so paradigm shifting. Just to take Michael as an example, here's somebody who has won far more Olympic medals than anybody in history, and maybe anybody will again. 23 gold medals, and the second most in history is only 9. So there's just such a differential in what he's done. But he's married to Miss California. He's got a beautiful family, a beautiful home. He's financially set. He's got all the things that on paper, we look at that, we check those boxes and say 1 + 1 + 1 equals happiness. And then you hear somebody who that's not the case so visibly. And I think it just completely shifts the paradigm. So with Michael and with Sasha and with all the athletes in the film, with Kevin Love in the NBA and DeMar DeRozan, and more and more of these athletes are raising their hand and talking about mental health. And I think that it has the potential, and not just has the potential, but is moving the needle around this conversation. So the first thing is I hope that the film helped to open a broader conversation about mental health. And secondly, I think, as the film revealed itself to me through sitting down with these courageous athletes, it became more and more apparent that the US Olympic organization needed to evolve into what they were providing. And I'm super grateful and humbled that, that has started to happen. There's still always much more work to do, but they have raised some additional funding and hired some additional therapists. And from what I'm hearing, filled some of the holes that existed.
Dr. Gunter, I'd like to circle back to you and circle back to this question about, can you achieve and still be mentally healthy? As someone who works with athletes all the time, this could apply to an athlete, or it could apply to an executive, or it could apply to a high school student. I mean, this could apply to just about anybody, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Can you strike that balance?
Yes, my immediate answer to that is yes, but I also want to honor and respect the experience that Sasha just shared, right? Like, you have to first have permission to even talk about what's going on for you, right? If you are in a system and a culture that does not allow room for you to share the fullness of your experience and only wants to promote the grind, the hustle, the pounding to the pavement, then it does become really difficult to have room to be healthy, because you can't even express that part of your experience. So I think that yes, it is possible, but what we have to do is we have to recognize that athletes are human. They are people, right? And even though they do extraordinary things in their field of competition, it's still people around them have to allow room for the other experience, for the times when they say, maybe I need a moment, maybe I need a break, maybe I need more support, maybe we have to allow them to need things that all of us as human needs, and have to be intentional then about creating an environment that not only promotes their success, but also helps to promote their wellness, right? Like, we have to be really intentional about that. And again, don't get me wrong, certainly there is a level of obsession that one has to have when pursuing the height of success that an Olympian experiences, right? Like, I'm not diminishing that, but I do say that there is a way to integrate wellness and to integrate a focus on health into that pursuit, right? But we have to allow room to hear their experience. We have to allow room for that wellness to be a part of the training program, right? And we have to shift our perception of what it takes to be great. All of the athletes that are featured in the film were not great because they never experienced challenges. Their greatness came because they learned how to navigate them, right? And so there's a certain level of navigating challenge and adversity that is required as a part of that success journey. Again, creating some balance and some wellness in the environment around them, I think, can be a way to help cultivate health in the pursuit of excellence.
Brett, what do you think the power is of telling these stories, telling the stories of real people, not just hypotheticals, but having these people tell their stories in their own voice, and then having them back to back to back talk about all of these gritty issues? Where's the power in that?
I think it's hard to measure, and that's why, my team at Podium Pictures, we're focused on doing more of this kind of work. You know, we did this deep dive into the Olympic world, and while certainly an Olympian shares some challenges in common with, say, an NFL player, there's also some very specific things. So we're looking to do that in some of these other sports worlds. But no, I think it's huge. And I'll tell you, I mean, I had a couple of in-person experiences where Michael and the other athletes, sometimes when we did panels like these, there was one where Sasha and I were both in New York for a panel with Michael, and I got to see firsthand just how affected he was, seeing that he wasn't alone in what he had experienced, and hearing from Sasha, and in this case, Katie Ulander, the skeleton racer. He thought he was alone in what he was experiencing, and what I observed was just an incredible sense of relief. And so I hope that all of us, whether we're Olympians or whatever we do, can feel the same sense of relief in knowing that everybody goes through these emotional challenges.
Sasha, was there that relief for you hearing your colleagues and other athletes speak about similar experiences? And in addition, by doing this, I mean, you have been so glorified as an athlete. Was this a way, in some ways, to take control of your own story and tell it from your own perspective?
I think I've noticed, I guess, to address the first part of your question, there is a huge power in community and in sharing hardship and knowing that you're going through something with others, that you're not alone. And I think there is, such stigma. I felt like there was such stigma for many reasons that you kind of wouldn't even quite admit it to yourself. And so I think it's huge to hear that other athletes who went to your same games, like 10 years later, you're talking about this with them. And I'll also say, I think team sports are much more supportive and conducive because you're on the field with someone, whether it's one or two other people or, a whole soccer team. And I think that helps a lot versus if you feel like you're doing it all alone. And if you're peaking in a sport much earlier, because if you're a gymnast, you're a figure skater, your childhood, your teenage years are really geared towards trying to achieve your peak. Whereas if you're a college athlete and you have those rites of passage, you play on a team sport, I think those things are much more supportive for mental health to simultaneously develop your identity as a college student, have that support from your teammates. But I guess what I would say is that, that is the beginning. And the more that we can get together and just admit the human experience and remove all the stigma, I think that is the grounds for knowing that you're doing something incredibly special, no matter what happens in that moment on that night. When you're 70 years old, you'll look back at this tremendous time in your life, and that it's what you gained, what you learned about yourself, the chance to compete on an Olympic stage, represent your country, is such an honor. And the takeaways are much bigger than what happened in those few seconds in your sport. So I think definitely the more that we can talk about it and talk about all dimensions of a sport and what someone learns versus just, did you win a gold medal? Did you not? Did you break a record? Did you not? And have it be a more expansive conversation, I think, are the steps in the right direction.
One of the parallels I noticed in the film was that many of the athletes talked about having this excess energy as a child, or potentially being diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. So Dr. Kotwiki, I want this question to go to you. A lot of these athletes who talked about this, it sounded like they funneled that energy into this passion, into this tunnel vision for their sport, which gave them that pathway, a place to put that energy. But this could also apply to other people in other industries, perfectionists, anybody who's really high achieving in their industry. Are people like that more likely to have mental health struggles?
Well, so I think getting to the science is a really important beginning point for this question, because mental illnesses, like a lot of other physical illnesses, arise by a complicated interconnection of nature and nurture. And so we know that mental illnesses run in families. Bipolar illness, or what we used to call manic depression, has the highest heritability of all mental illnesses. But even things like depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, alcohol misuse, and then the thing that surprises most people is that suicide completions actually have a genetic underpinning. And so if you're an American who doesn't have a family history of completed suicides, your risk of dying by suicide in the past 2 or 3 years was roughly 13 to 14 out of every 100,000 Americans. Whereas if you're a person who has a first-degree relative who died by suicide, your risk is about 8 to 10 times higher than that. So there's a genetic conference of risk of even things that initially look behavioral, like suicide completions, that are programmed in somebody's genes. But that's really only part of the story. The other part of the story is what happens in the environment. And it's the stress part. What things you experience, particularly when you're in those important developmental years, kind of 6 up through 18 or so, that would confer either more or less risk of those genes for mental illnesses to turn on and to start an episode of a mental illness up to and including suicide. And so the interplay between nature and nurture is really important. And so if somebody has the biologic mania or the untreated ADHD or something else that stems from the pathophysiology of mental illnesses, adding a layer of constant stress on top of that makes it much more likely that person is going to go on to have a mental illness. So you can't change your genes yet. Hopefully someday that might be one solution to this. But what we can do is to help people, especially children, develop resiliency so that they can withstand more stress without having the ramifications of the genetic predisposition to produce a mental illness.
Dr. Gunter, I'd like you to follow up on that. How do we do that? How do we build that resiliency? And what do parents and coaches or close friends and allies look out for? What are the signs to be aware of?
So the how do you build that resiliency part, I'm glad you came back to that, because I had an additional thought in regards to how do we integrate health into kind of our path and pursuit of excellence. And I was thinking, we spend a lot of time focused on the physical aspect of sport. We develop strength, flexibility, conditioning, but we don't really spend time teaching kids or older athletes, adult athletes, how to take care of and manage their emotional selves while they are also training, right? And so I think if we could integrate some specific skills to help people in managing their emotional and mental and psychological selves as a part of their training regimen, that's something that could help build resilience, right? Because resilience is not just the ability to bounce back, it's the ability to navigate stressors, right? It's the ability to cope with the stress and still continue to move forward. Resilience doesn't eliminate all the stress. So thinking about how can we help people to maintain that motivation? How can we help people to engage in self-talk that is encouraging and uplifting rather than self-defeating? How can we help people to learn how to be aware of when they are reaching a stress point for themselves? Like, do you know when you are reaching a point where you are experiencing stress and need to take a break? What does that look like? For some people, it's cognitive symptoms, like maybe they have difficulty focusing and concentrating. For others, maybe it's behavioral. They start to withdraw from others. For other people, it might be physical. They experience aches, headaches, muscle aches, increased fatigue. So knowing and having an awareness of what your stress looks like is one of the ways to help build resilience, because then when you start to feel that, it is a sign that you now need to set a boundary somewhere, and you need to be intentional about engaging in activities that will, quote unquote, help to refill your cup, if you will, right? But it starts with that awareness. And then it starts with you identifying, what are the things that make me feel energized? Is it connecting with people? Do I need to detach? Do I need to exercise? Do I need more sleep? What's my nutrition intake looking like? All of those things sound very basic, but those are things that help to create health from the inside out, right? And so thinking about that resilience in terms of what awareness do I have, right? About what I need to feel healthy. How intentional am I about engaging in those activities? What boundaries am I putting in place? Sometimes we need to think about self-care, not as in terms of just what I'm adding, but also what I'm taking away. Do I need to remove something from my plate, right? That is not serving me in some capacity. And so I think those are some of the things that we can think about in terms of developing that resilience. For parents, coaches, look for changes in behavior, significant changes in behavior. That's a sign that something else might be going on. Increased feelings of hopelessness can absolutely be a sign that something's happening. If you see intense emotions that seem inconsistent with the situation that a person is experiencing, that also may be a sign that additional support may be needed in those moments.
I think one of the best things I heard you say there is you talked about specific action items, things that people can do, which takes away that helpless factor and that helpless feeling, which can sometimes overwhelm you when you're feeling really low in that valley. And we've only got a few more minutes before we take some questions, but I'm going to head to Dr. Kotwiki before I wrap up with Brett and Sasha here. So Dr. Kotwiki, I think we have to stay on this for one more moment, because if you are that person who notices these signs and symptoms, somebody who's struggling, which is totally normal, how do you even go about approaching that conversation? What do you say? What do you do? Give us a roadmap.
Yeah, so I think the temptation is to avoid having a conversation. That can be difficult. And this is exactly the time to be direct and transparent and truthful about what somebody is observing. So just to dispel a myth, talking about anything does not increase the likelihood that somebody who already isn't in the situation is going to think about it or do it. So talking with your teenager children about sex isn't going to make them want to have sex more, because they already want to have sex more. And in the same way, talking about suicide is not going to introduce the idea of suicide into anybody's head who isn't already thinking about a suicide attempt. And so the first question that should come out of anybody's mouth when they're concerned about somebody from a mental health perspective is, a lot of people who are anxious like you are, or who are depressed, consider suicide. Is that something that you're thinking about? And if so, tell me what your plan is, and then get help to figure out what you can do to manage that. Call somebody like me or like Dr. Gunter or even 911, because when somebody is thinking about suicide, that's a medical emergency, just like if they were having a heart attack or a stroke or any other problem. And then I think, secondly, if you can feel confident that somebody isn't in an imminent crisis situation, it's important to connect people with resources that are available as soon as possible. And what we know is that the longer that somebody goes with untreated mental illness, particularly untreated depression, which we're seeing can affect somebody's cognitive abilities, it affects your cardiovascular health, it makes people have a more difficult time controlling their weight, on and on and on. Untreated depression, just like untreated psychosis or anything else, is really a bad prognostic indicator. And so the earlier that somebody can get connected, the better. In Georgia, we have a resource available for free 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, called the Georgia Crisis and Access Line, or GCAL. And anybody can call that number and speak with a person to help figure out what to do next. And then third, and then I'll stop, but get support for yourself. Because being in a situation where you're worried about somebody you love can take its toll on you. And oftentimes people assume the responsibility when they are not a professional and in a position to be able to offer effective and respectful care to somebody. So get support for yourself.
Christy, can I offer one point right before you switch? And certainly echo everything that was just said. But one point that I want to make is when we say mental health, we often think mental illness. And so I just want to make the point that mental health really is a continuum. And certainly we're having a conversation about the illness part of that continuum, but mental health also includes wellness. And so thinking about what you are doing to promote mental health within yourself in the same way that we think about physical health. If we are physically ill, we take steps to restore our health to baseline functioning. But when we think about physical health, we also think about what we're doing to enhance our health, right? Exercise is not necessarily because I feel unhealthy, but I know that helps me to continue to feel healthy and maintain and enhance my health. So I really just wanted to say that point, that when we think mental health, it is a continuum. certainly there's the illness part, but the part that we also need to think about is, what am I doing to promote health from a mental and emotional standpoint in my life on a daily basis, even if nothing feels like it's going wrong, right? Because you don't have to necessarily feel ill or be sick in order to work on getting better.
I'm really glad you added that. Thank you, Dr. Gunter. To close out this section, Brett, I'm coming to you next because your documentary, your film, shone a spotlight on some pretty significant gaps in care for the Olympics and for these athletes. So I think the next natural question is, has anything changed? Because the first part is to bring the awareness, to talk about it, to tell people that it's happening. But I know we spoke about how you plan to circle back with some of these athletes. Has anything changed? Has anything improved to your knowledge?
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what Sasha's experience has been, both as an alumni and just talking to other alumni and maybe some current Olympians that she's in touch with. But, you know, from my understanding, the USOPC went and raised 1.5 million through some philanthropists named Gary and Yuka Reichel up in Montana. And they're utilizing those funds to hire more therapists. They hired a new head of mental health services. I think her name is Jessica Bartlett. And I think another thing from what I understand they've done is put full-time therapists, not performance coaches, but therapists, because there's a difference. There's a lot of performance coaches, but they're not necessarily equipped or interested in dealing with some of the depression, anxiety, et cetera. To have people full-time at each of the facilities. There's, what, Sasha, 3 or 4 around the country. There's Lake Placid, Chula Vista, Colorado Springs. And those didn't necessarily have full-time people. If you watch the film, you see the scene where Jeremy Bloom talks about his teammate, Jarrett Speedy Peterson, sharing with him that, you know, he was having suicidal ideation and didn't know where else to go to talk about it. So those are the things that I've heard about. But Sasha, have you heard anything on your end about things evolving?
You know, I know that since the film especially, it's become certainly something that alumni talk about, but not being an athlete competing myself, I think I'm not in the line of fire in terms of what's being done. I will echo the difference between a therapist and a performance coach, because performance specialists were certainly made available to us, but there was never really even an acknowledgement or a question, are you doing okay mentally? Are you having a tough time? We have resources. So there wasn't even that awareness. Those kind of conversations weren't being had 20 years ago when I was competing. So I'm happy to see that that much has certainly changed. So I think you're probably more on the forefront of what's happening and how it's evolving, but it's happening in concert also with athletes feeling frustrated, which is probably part of the mental health issue, with feeling lost as they transition. And so I think the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee has also felt the pressure to step up, you know, access to resources in terms of education, career transition for these athletes that are no longer competing. You know, 2 separate things, but if you don't have a sense of purpose, if you don't feel like you have an education or you don't have a next step or place to go, that can certainly aggravate your mental health issues and just the struggle you have when you retire.
Sasha, I'll give you the last word here, because I think about how you were competing in that era before this conversation evolved. So in many ways, you had an even more difficult and isolated journey through mental health. This is kind of a compound question here, but I think about the moment when you've prepared for years for a moment that lasts maybe seconds or just a few minutes long. And then the moment you're off the ice, you have a camera and a microphone in your face from someone like me who is trying to get your reaction. You probably haven't even had time to, you know, process what happened, whether it was good or bad or how you feel about it. And all of a sudden you're still on the world stage as people are watching those layers of emotion. How did you cope? And you kind of had to do this on your own. So what did you figure out for yourself as a way to cope?
You know, in recent years, I've found more healthy ways to cope, but I think, you know, as a young kid, in a sport where there's pressure to be perfect and pressure to be thin, you know, there's certainly, you know, during my teenage years, dealt with an eating disorder as a coping mechanism was, you know, I would say probably like my healthier escape would be to like listen to books on tape, you know, and to like remove my world, because just the anxiety and the pressure of what was expected of me, and what I expected of myself was so immense. And so I was pretty alone, and I think it took me many years. So I think that really was one of the reasons I was so excited when this film came along and other athletes were lending their voice. I was like, finally, like I've been going through so much here and I've been struggling. I've been anxious, I've been depressed, I haven't been dealing with this in the best way. But I think, you know, throughout my 20s, I found a therapist, you know, I found yoga, I found meditation. And I think the biggest thing I found was community, and nothing has made me feel as good as when I can share my story, whether it's a platform like this or whether it's with another athlete who went through the same thing, or someone who's wasn't an athlete at all and just dealing with it. And I think it's just having these conversations, knowing you're not alone. It can be part of the human condition at some spectrum, right? You know, there's severe depression, and then there are people just having a tough day. And I think having someone there to talk to, having a support system, and having permission to talk about it, I've found to be the most helpful things in coping with stress and depression and anxiety.
Well, I want to say thanks to each of you for contributing to this conversation. It's been really powerful. I'd like to spend the last 10 to 12 minutes taking some questions. And we have a few people who have written in. I think this one's a really interesting one. I'm going to open it up to the floor. So feel free, any of you guys, if you want to come off mute, because I think any of you four could answer this one. It said, since there really is no alternative to explore other identities because sports require enormous amounts of practice, you simply don't have the time to pick up a violin or baking or gaming or something else. So how can an athlete maintain a balanced identity? Can they at all? Sasha, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sorry, I was just choking on my water.
breathe first.
You know, I think the biggest thing would be, especially for people starting their sport at such a young age, before they've really had a chance to develop as adolescents and explore their interests, is for their coach, their mentors, their parents to really encourage them to have other interests. Because I guess one of the perks of a sport is physically you can only train at that kind of level for so many hours a day, even if it's 6 hours. And that gives you time to think about, you know, your life as a whole and your life after sports. Are you interested in science? Are you interested in politics? And to start cultivating those interests and relationships outside of sport. And I think that just fleshes out one's identity so that you know that you are more than just an athlete and you have other things to look forward to. Because the biggest thing for me is like, I couldn't imagine the day after the Olympics. Like it seemed like life ended the end of February 2006. It was hard to conceive of what I would wake up and do the next day. And so I think if along developing an athletic career, you're also developing your other interests, your identity as a person, your friends outside of sports, I think it would lend itself to making the transition much easier.
If I could add to that, I think I would say, in addition to everything that Sasha just said, is I think we have to reframe how developing those other interests can actually help to enhance your training and your development in your sport, right? Like thinking about the ways in which you cultivate relationships, thinking about the ways in which you take time to maybe explore video gaming or do another sport, right? That may not be your primary sport. You do another activity. I think we have to redefine how stepping away from the sport and doing other things enhances your experience within the sport, right? And think about balance as a way of, as a performance enhancement strategy, right? Like thinking about it in that kind of way, and not just performance enhancement in your sport, but performance in life, right? Like it helps you to feel better mentally, to then show up better in your sport. And it's not something that takes away. So I think kind of reimagining what cultivating other habits really does for you. It doesn't take away from your training. It actually can enhance it because it gives you that balance in that space that Sasha was talking about.
And Christy, can I just add, observational learning is really powerful, probably more powerful than hearing things. And so it is incumbent on the important people, the role models in everybody's life, to actually do the behaviors that we're asking our children to do. And so you can say you need to diversify your interest pool and you need to try things that you're bad at to show that you can fail well or whatever. But if you don't do that yourself, that's going to be the message that people receive. So modeling what we're asking people to do is equally, if not more important, than trying to explain through words why it's important to diversify interests.
So this next question comes from Lori, who's listening to all of you and saying what you're all verbalizing is so important. And to her, it crosses over to so many individuals beyond athletes. And while they may not be athletes, feel their perfection is the end to all success. That seems to be the connecting thread. She said she is particularly concerned about our young people in school feeling the weight of doing their best without awareness of their mental health. Dr. Kotwiki or Dr. Gunter, do you guys have any insight to kids who may be feeling this intense pressure in school?
Sure. I mean, I'll start very quickly and then turn it over. I think one of the things that I really try to emphasize with kids and even with adolescent and adult athletes and people is just this notion of focusing on excellence versus perfection. I think sometimes when we focus on perfection, it results in us focusing on where we think we are lacking and what we think we haven't done. And it also results in us comparing ourselves to others a great deal, right? Perfection is sometimes not necessarily about the outcome, but it's about doing something well enough such that others will give me praise and validation for it. If they think it's okay, then it's okay, right? And so that's what perfection does. Excellence, on the other hand, allows us to kind of use ourselves as a point of comparison. Am I doing better than I did yesterday, right? And with perfection, there's only room for maybe one person to be perfect, but with excellent, we can all be excellent, right? So it allows more freedom for us to focus on my strengths, my talents, enhancing those and allowing those to show up in my performance, whatever it may be, versus comparing myself to others and then trying to reach this potentially unattainable goal of perfection, right? So that's one shift that I really encourage for kids is focus on being excellent, right? Which all of us can do. And again, focuses on your strengths, your skills, minimizes the comparison, but allows you to strive and work toward being better than you were the day before, as opposed to reaching maybe an unattainable goal of perfection.
And I totally agree with what Dr. Gunter just said. I might phrase it in a little bit of a different way, which is I'm not a huge fan of participation trophies, where if you show up, you get a trophy for being there because you're doing something. But I do think that the way that we give rewards and tell children and students that they're doing a good job can really be an effort-based reward system. And so you may not get a trophy, but did you try your best and did you have fun? And is this important to you? Rather than are you doing this so that I will be proud of you? And I think if we recalibrate that perspective, that can go a long way to easing some of the perceived anxiety in school. But I want to add just really quickly, anxiety in and of itself isn't a bad thing. And we know that if you didn't have any anxiety, it would be really tempting not to do things sometimes, to stay at home and sleep all day and watch bad TV and eat Doritos. So some anxiety is probably very motivating. It's when the anxiety tips the scale so that somebody becomes paralyzed or somebody becomes so focused on whatever it is that they're trying to achieve that they can't experience pleasure in other components of their lives. So, without, I think, saying anxiety is terrible, let's remove pressure from performance and, everybody can get a participation trophy. I think we can recalibrate the way we look at that.
A couple people have asked this next question, so this seems to be of real interest. They want to know the importance of the role of parents for young athletes in their mental wellness journey, especially since kids are so dedicated and specialized, maybe in one sport at a very young age. It's become a big money-making business. And one person says it's hard for parents not to get caught up in all of the hype, and it can put a lot of pressure on kids. So Sasha, I'd be really interested to hear from you, first of all, what role did your parents play, and what were the benefits in as their role? What helped you, and what advice would you give to other parents who may be parenting a kid like you?
I think I was lucky to have such a supportive mother, but also a mother that, was able to stay home and then able to, dedicate most of her life driving around Southern California to different rinks and physical therapists and dressmakers and ballet studios and physical therapists. And so that was a big sacrifice on her part. And I think expanding to my family as a whole, my dad, my grandparents, I think, I was lucky that we were interested in things outside of sports. And so at family gatherings, there'd be a little bit of talk about ice skating, but it would be about travel and teaching and other things that were going on in other people's lives. And I think that's very healthy. So I guess my advice, for a parent is to be patient, to try to instill that no matter where the sport goes, the sport will teach you really important things about yourself, because there's adversity, there's struggle, and you face these things in yourself at a young age, and they will serve you for the rest of your life. So to look at them as lessons and opportunities of how you can react to tough moments in your sport. And then also, I think just to talk about other things, to talk about other interests. I think, again, these are points that really help the young athlete realize that sport is just a part of their life, and that they're more than just that, and their parents see more than that in them, and that takes space in their lives.
I want to give anybody else an opportunity. Does anybody else want to chime in on that question about the role of parents before we move on?
The only thing I was going to say echoes the last point that Sasha made, which is be the person who sees your child as the human that they are, right? Like, yes, it may be easy to get caught up in the hype, but it is so important for parents not to get caught up in that, because then the child has no escape, right? Not only are they on and they are the athlete or the performer when they are in their field of play and in their competition, but then they're also on when they're at home, because they're now seen as the athlete there as well. And so, there's no need to rehash the game in the car ride in the car ride home. Like, allow that just to be downtime, definitely.
And I think our time is winding down, so let's make this the last question. And Brett, I'd love to get your perspective on this too, because you talk to so many athletes, specifically ones who have retired from their sport. And this question comes from Kimberly. She said, when athletes retire, how much of an impact is our basic biology of an endorphin crash due to decreased practices on producing negative thoughts and moods that could lead to depression? You talked to several athletes who experienced a post-Olympic depression. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think first of all, for a lot of Olympians, they don't know if they're going to do another Olympics or not. So they have this, something like 4-year process where are they going to be in another Olympics, or are they moving on with their life? And I've also seen, there's certain athletes who are in the film who I think are active and don't know what to do next. And I think that, to the point Sasha made earlier, this opportunity to provide them with an off-ramp that eases the transition is huge. I think about, I played baseball at a pretty competitive level, but I knew I wasn't going to play in college. I went away to a 4-year school, went to the University of Arizona, and joined a group of thousands of other people my age who were making that same transition. If you're walking away from your sport and you're 25 years old or 32 years old. There's not a bunch of people that are doing it at the same time. So I imagine it must feel very, very isolating. So I think, one thing that definitely needs to be talked about and enhanced is, this having a safety net, so that when all kinds of athletes, this isn't specific to the Olympics, you see it in the NFL big time, you see it in baseball, it's in every sport. We need to provide resources so that these athletes can make a soft landing.
And the name of that documentary, I want to make sure we mention it. It is called The Weight of Gold. It's an HBO sports documentary. I highly recommend it. It's an excellent film. Thank you all for this really important discussion and conversation. We've had a lot of people talk about how impactful it was tonight. So Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christy. And I want to add my thanks to all of you for such a meaningful discussion about this important topic. I want to thank Sasha and Brett for bringing attention to the need to better support the mental health of our Olympic athletes, showing how even the strongest among us are affected by issues like anxiety and depression is a powerful message, and one that hopefully will tear down barriers to people asking for help and seeking treatment. The Weight of Gold is currently available to watch on HBO Max. And I understand from Brett, the film has just been nominated for a Sports Emmy Award. So congratulations to Brett and to everyone associated with the film, and best of luck in June for the Emmys. And Christy, thank you so much to you, who, as a Rosalind Carter Fellow for Mental Health Journalism, you have committed to using the media as a tool to educate communities about mental health. Over the past 25 years, more than 220 journalists from around the world have been awarded this very highly competitive fellowship offered by the Carter Center here in Atlanta, and we're very, very proud. One of our own here in Atlanta is one of the fellows. And of course, I want to thank Dr. Kotwiki and Dr. Gunter, who, through their work directly with patients, as well as through their leadership in both the psychiatric and psychological professional communities, are helping to advance the prevention and treatment of mental illnesses. And again, many thanks to Duval and Rex Fuqua and Edwina and Tom Johnson for making this lecture possible. And my final thank you is to all of you who are listening in this evening. We appreciate your participation, and I hope that you'll stay connected to Skyland Trail to learn more about future community education events and how you can support individuals struggling with mental illness in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that wraps up our 10th Dorothy C. Fuqua Lecture Series. Thank you again to all of you, and have a good night.